Hello, everyone. My name is Leo Hickman. I'm the editor of Carbon Brief. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, which is just over 24 hours since COP29 formally ended in Baku in Azerbaijan. And as you can see, I'm joined by my colleagues who were across the fortnight were all at COP29, and we've got about an hour really to sort of go through both your questions that you've been already sending in, but hopefully you can also send them in via the chat box or the Q&A box. I never quite remember, but you'll see where the activity is. I think the Q&A box. And we'll try and go through as best we can kind of actually what happened at COP this year, and also kind of what the key outcomes were. Hopefully you've all seen our kind of quite epic article that we published late yesterday, which really does walk through some of the granular detail of the COP. And yeah, just go onto our homepage at carbonbrief.org and have a look through that. But many of the issues I'm sure will come up in this discussion. Okay, well, rather than waste any more time, let's kick off. And what I'm going to do is ask each of my colleagues in turn to just very quickly explain what they themselves were following at the COP this year. So if I can start with Simon, please. Simon, can you just kind of let everyone know what you particularly were sort of tracking and maybe some of the things that sort of caught your attention?
Yeah, thanks, Leo. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, please do use the Q&A box, as Leo mentioned, if you've got questions. So I'm Dr. Simon Evans. I'm the Deputy Editor and Senior Policy Editor at Carbon Brief. And I was out in Baku for the first week of the summit. But I was watching very closely throughout. And the topics that I was particularly tracking were Article 6, which is about carbon markets under the Paris Agreement, and also something called the UAE Dialogue, which was supposed to be kind of carrying forward the outcome of the global stocktake last year, which obviously kind of famously included the deal on transitioning away from fossil fuels. I think the sort of most striking thing that happened across the 2 weeks in terms of those two areas was right in the very sort of dying moment of the plenary at COP29, where the deal on the UAE dialogue was not agreed. It's quite an unusual situation where they actually had a draft decision in front of them that had been published by the COP presidency. But a number of negotiating blocs objected in the closing plenary, and so it didn't get adopted, and that all gets kicked down the road now to COP30 in Brazil next year. But with that, I'll pass on to colleagues to say more.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Simon. Daisy, can I come to you next, please? Can you kind of give everyone a sense of what you were tracking at COP this year?
Thanks, Leo. So my name is Daisy Dunne. I'm Carbon Brief's Associate Editor, and I was in Baku for 2 weeks following the whole of COP. So one of the things I was following particularly closely is Azerbaijan's role in guiding the negotiations as the COP29 presidency. So you'll probably be familiar with Azerbaijan coming under a lot of scrutiny. So before the summit, there were allegations that Azerbaijan was planning to use the summit to make future oil and gas deals. And as Azerbaijan took on its more negotiator leadership role in the second week of the summit, they faced more allegations of excluding certain parties from the talks and malpractice. And we saw a very extraordinary final plenary with a lot of drama, which I'm sure we'll get into a bit more. So that was one of the major things. I was also following the fallout from the US election and how biodiversity was covered. So happy to answer any questions about that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Daisy. Josh, can I turn to you next, please?
Hello, my name is Josh Gabbatiss. I'm the policy correspondent at Carbon Brief. I was also in Azerbaijan for 2 weeks. I was primarily following the negotiations around a new global climate finance target, which is all about sort of raising money for developing countries to help them tackle climate change. It's very fraught negotiations with huge divisions between developed and developing countries, and we saw that play out over 2 weeks. They came to a decision which has faced a lot of backlash since, with a sort of central goal of raising $300 billion each year by 2035 for developing countries, and that will be largely provided by developed countries. There is also a sort of broader goal, which you might have seen talked about, which is 1.3 trillion per year, but that is a bit more complicated and should be taken with a grain of salt, perhaps. But I can get into those kind of questions later on if anyone's interested.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I think we've already had some questions asking for a bit of clarity on what exactly that 300 billion goal means, by when, who pays, etc., etc. So we'll definitely come back to that. Aruna, do you want to go next, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Aruna. I cover food, land, and nature at Carbon Brief, and was also tracking a couple of negotiations which were quite spicy. One of them was on response measures, which is essentially in countries that are still dependent or have fossil fuels in the energy mix, and we're transitioning away or are dependent on forest economies, and talking about deforestation, of essentially how climate change impacts or policies can impact people. So which was interesting. Also the fact that this has been quite a heated track of negotiations. On the 6th of November, China, leading the basic countries, had put forward a proposal. This is right after Trump's win. It's the second year in a row asking for unilateral trade measures to be included in the COP for a discussion. While it was put on the provisional agenda, that was one of the things that was dropped. But the presidency began consultations on the matter, which ended without consensus. But it said that there were constructive decisions. But in the formal negotiating tracks, one of the things that came out of COP29 was a decision to continue the work plan of especially talking about on the Forum on Response Measures. And it has an inclusion of an item which says that conversations around trade, possibly for the first time, will have a seat in climate talks and under this work plan, which also includes things like the EU's carbon border adjustment, the US IRA, and also things around global laws around deforestation and other regulations, which is quite an interesting win. Was also following agriculture and food security, which was a lot more muted this time around. Countries largely agreed to set up a web portal where small farmers, others, countries, observers can submit projects. But the interesting thing is that it was also linked to being able to ask for collaboration as well as finance. And that was passed quite early in the subsidiary body negotiations. I was also following Article 6, and Simon's already given you the major lowdown on that. But yeah, of course, in terms of certain kinds of afforestation and reforestation projects being able to continue under the CDM as part of the new Article 6 carbon markets and concerns around that, those were things which were also quite contentious at COP29. Yeah, more of that in the details.
Thank you, Aruna. And I probably just should add, actually, that you've covered some of the topics that you're specializing on, but we'll have another piece we'll be publishing later in this week, which will be highlighting and zooming in particularly on the key outcomes from COP29 on food systems, land use, biodiversity, etc. In fact, and Daisy and Aruna are both feeding into that article, which is being prepared right now. And both of you were also at the COP16 Biodiversity Summit, just whatever that was, a month or so ago in Colombia. So it's interesting to have cross comparison between two different COP processes. Okay, can I go to Wan Yuan? Can you give us a sense of what you were tracking, please?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. It's Wan Yuan Song. I'm the China section editor here. I'm tracking China, what China did and what China said at COP29. And my highlight is China used the language of climate finance to talk about its overseas aid for the first time at COP. So it declared it has provided and mobilized project funds of more than 177 billion yuan, which is about 24 billion US dollars for developing countries' climate response. This would put China almost on par with the UK to become the joint 5th largest provider of climate finance in the world.
Brilliant, thank you, Wan Yuan. And then finally, Molly, can you just give us a sense of what you were following, please?
Of course. I'm Molly Lempriere. I'm section editor for policy at Carbon Brief. I was following the Mitigation Work Programme, Adaptation, and the Just Transition Work Programme. All three of these saw quite a lot of deadlock happening across the 2 weeks. So in adaptation of the 5 different negotiating tracks, only one actually made it through to the final plenary. Everything else was Rule 16, which means it will be pushed back to next summer. So we saw the global goal on adaptation finally passed at the end, but there was quite a lot of disagreement over means of implementation over the course of the couple of weeks. Then mitigation work program, the big thing was around the high level political messages in it, and it got watered down quite a lot so that it was mostly just focused on the dialogues that happened under it. And then the Just Transition work program passed the end of COP without any formal agreement at all. There was a lot of pushback from people involved in it against the presidency, where they viewed that it was particularly disruptive of functional talks. Yeah, so those are my 3 main tracks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Molly, and thanks, everyone. I think let's start with finance, right? Because it's the big headline, I guess, in many ways that came. Everyone's now talking about this $300 billion by 2035 number. Josh, we've got a question here from Lilith Nijeru, who is a reporter with a Nation newspaper in Kenya, who I think actually we met, and she came and said hello to us in the which was wonderful. But her question is a really pertinent one, which is she's really wanting closer kind of clarity on what is meant. So she's saying that some experts are arguing that reporting this 300 billion a year is misleading, because does it mean per year? Does it mean from next year and building up from the 100 billion to 300 billion by 2035? I agree, it is a bit confusing. I don't know, Josh, whether you can sort of help unpack that a little bit from what we understand.
Sure. So the 300 billion by 2035, the fact that it's by 2035 is significant. So if we look at this very broadly, there is a division very generally in the negotiations between what developing countries want and what developed countries want. A lot of the developing country submissions, like demands ahead of the COP and during the negotiations, were for a goal which started basically from next year. So it would go to something like $1 trillion a year from 2025, and that was specified. So it would say, for 2025 through to 2035, $1 trillion a year. The less sort of ambitious, you could call them, submissions by parties like the US, I think the EU, were more like by 2035. So the implication is you only have to get to 300 billion a year in 2035. And before that, I mean, I guess you would assume, and looking at the past trajectory of climate finance, that they'll gradually increase to that level over the next decade. It's not clear though, it doesn't specify they have to do that. I think the concern is that, yeah, in theory, they could just carry on giving the same amount every year, and then in 2035 they could increase it to that. I think in practice, that's probably not what will happen. It's not what's happened in the past, but you never know, because obviously there's a lot. I mean, we just have to look at the thing is there's the COP and there's the real world, right? So you've got Donald Trump is about to become president. He could cut climate finance massively. You have right-wing governments in Europe, in places like Italy, and got an election in Germany where there might be a sort of rightward turn. These are big donors, and there are parties in those countries that are not interested in providing help to foreign countries. Yeah, and just looking at what's already happened in the UK and in European countries, a lot of them have already cut their aid budgets. So basically, not having the certainty of, specifying how much will be given every year up to 2035 is a worry for developing countries and for civil society groups who are interested in this sort of thing. Yeah, I can't be any more specific than that, but that's
and
I hope that's helpful.
On that point, are future COPs going to drill into the specificity and who's going and what type of funds, or is that just number now locked in, or are we now going to get continuing years of people trying to refine who how is that 300 billion exactly carved up, and who pays what by when? Or is this kind of intentionally vague now for the next decade?
I think there is an intentional vagueness, to be sure. I mean, it's basically the target mirrors the language in large part of the previous climate finance goal, which was 100 billion a year by 2020. And so it says, I can't remember the exact wording, but it's basically from a variety of sources, public and private, bilateral and multilateral, including private finance. So basically it's a variety of sources. It's kind of leaving it open. This money could come from a few different places. And in terms of who provides it, divvying up the number, so you say a certain amount gets given by the US, a certain amount by UK, Japan, etc. That isn't in it, and like I think it's very unlikely that would ever happen. That kind of thing, naming names and sort of dividing things up between countries is just something which is incredibly difficult to do in the COP process. So yeah, there is going to be a review of the goal in 5 years' time, but I think as it stands, it's kind of unclear what that review would entail and whether it would sort of lead to a ramping up of ambition or anything like that. The other final thing is I'll just say is that there was a last-minute addition to the text, which was the result of pressure from African countries and I think also Colombia and some islands and least developed countries. So there's this thing called the Baku to Belém roadmap, which is all about kind of they will produce a report next year at the next COP. Unclear what that report will be about, but it's something to do with scaling up climate finance further. It's kind of like a little nod to sort of the need to carry on ramping up ambition. But people I've spoken to have said, this was added in at the last minute. We don't really know what it is. No, it's just very unclear at this point. So yeah, that's where we're at with it.
All right, thanks, Josh. Yeah, we've got lots of great questions flying in at the moment. Quite hard to sort of go through them quickly, but I've noticed that some carbon market and Article 6 questions are coming in. So maybe we should ask probably Simon and Aruna to have a go at this. We've got a question. Well, the first question is Maya D'Souza is saying, I wonder if you can tell us about the Article 6 negotiations and whether progress has been made in putting in place a robust and equitable system. And then we've also got another question, which I think has just popped into the chat box from Lena Lefstad saying, would you please give your take on the rapidly passed Article 6.4 text? Simon and Aruna, I don't know if it's probably your best place to take on those questions, because it was a big headline, I think, as well, that came out of COP, was the whole carbon market deal.
Yeah, thanks, Leo. I've been trying to answer some questions in the Q&A box as we're going, including a few about Article 6. So, I mean, I guess the first thing to say is that, this is quite a big moment for Article 6 because they've been trying to negotiate and agree something, and kind of finalise this for years now. At two recent previous COPs, I think it was Madrid, COP25 in Madrid and COP28 last year, or the sort of entire negotiations basically collapsed on Article 6. So they got they got hit with Rule 16, which is Rule 16 the sort of the rules of procedure at the UN climate talks, and that basically means they couldn't even agree a procedural outcome that says we talked about it, we're going to talk about this next year. They wouldn't even agree to that. So what that means is that it got kicked down the road and it just pops up again on the agenda the following year. So given that kind of history, the fact that they have kind of finalised, Article 6, there's two different parts. One's about country-to-country trading under Article 6.2, and the other one's this new international carbon market, which is being called the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. And it's basically, if you remember your kind of Kyoto Protocol, it's the successor to the Clean Development Mechanism. So both parts got agreed, and so now it's a case of actually starting to implement things. I mean, one of those questions I think alluded to what happened right at the very start of the COP. So on the first day, the presidency kind of pushed through this agreement on two documents which had been adopted by the supervisory body that runs the international carbon market under Article 6. And those are basically guidelines on how you draw up methodologies to work out how many carbon credits a particular kind of project should issue, and a separate one on projects involving carbon removal. Now, basically, like the presidency was trying to secure like a, kind of like an early win at the COP, which is what happened last year with the loss and damage fund being adopted on the first day, and that was sort of supposed to inject momentum into the talks more broadly. The problem with the Article 6 thing being pushed through so early on was that, unlike the loss and damage fund, a lot of people aren't that keen on carbon markets, and so the fact that they pushed it through got a lot of pushback. There were some parties. I think it's probably fair to say that most parties were kind of okay with it, because they kind of just wanted it to be over with, and they felt like those documents were in a much better place than they'd been a year earlier in Dubai. But there were certainly some parties very unhappy with that process of pushing it through early. And yeah, that wasn't the only thing that happened on Article 6. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that got agreed over the course of the 2 weeks, but I've already gone into too much detail probably, so I'll pass over to Aruna.
No, just to add, of course, the pressure to repeat what was done and give a success on day one, and the fact that, of course, there'd been negotiations, but there was also concerns of the fact that, okay, well, it wasn't necessarily approved by countries, those particular recommendations on the methodologies. And that was the fear where, many activist groups as well felt that all of the concerns around human rights, also in terms of reversals, many of those tools had not yet been firmly put in place. The idea of reversals is in terms of, what if forest burns down, do those credits end up going up in hot smoke? What concerns around indigenous people and consent, and in terms of the language there. So there was the thing of getting that through first, without countries being part of some of those processes as well as documents. But Article 6.4 eventually became, there was a little bit more guidance. It looked like it was in better shape, but 6.2, a lot of the question around transparency around it. And that's something that Simon has written in quite detailed a piece, that there is a requirement for more sort of information, but in terms of consequences of whether inconsistencies that are seen in these projects and how to hold those to account, there's very weak language around that in terms of requests countries to deal with, but doesn't define what are persistent or significant inconsistencies with sort of carbon market projects or those deals which have been struck between countries, which again leaves that as a very challenging space. At the end of this, and the sort of signals it sends towards the rest of carbon markets.
Thanks, Aruna. Thanks, Simon. Daisy, we have a question here from Lucas Slotus, who's asking about the fossil fuel phase out, which was a big feature of the Dubai kind of outcome, wasn't it? The language around transitioning away from fossil fuels. I wonder if you can give a sense of how that discussion played out at COP29, because it's Lucas is asking about whether, no new states announced having joined the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, and what is your sense of how the strength or the significance of that particular alliance and other initiatives to push for the fossil fuel phase out? Maybe Daisy, give us a sense of how that whole debate played out.
Thank you. I'm very happy to answer a question about the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. My colleagues will know I'm quite fascinated by this alliance, because I went to the launch of BOGA back at COP26 in Glasgow, and at the time it was the most sought after event at COP26. So I had to push my way through crowds to get into the press conference room, waving my press badge in the air. And so for those who don't know, it's a kind of small group of countries that have said they will move away from oil and gas in a bid to tackle climate change. So it was co-founded by Costa Rica and Denmark. At the time, Costa Rica had a progressive government. Since their government has changed and Costa Rica's role in the alliance has become diminished. So they're a small group of countries. I think when they launched, they were about 12, and every year at COP, they kind of give us an update of where they are, and only a couple of countries have joined this each year. And at COP29 in Baku, I went to their ministerial event, and it was for the first time no new countries joined. So I think, yeah, it just shows that they've not really been able to get kind of make a lot of ground, a lot of headway, and move forward and really expand their membership. I should say as well, last year, Colombia became a friend of BOGA, and that was like the first time that a major fossil fuel country showed their allegiance with this group. I think when you compare that to, as you mentioned, Leo, the fossil fuel transition that was agreed in Dubai, you know, every country that is a party to the Paris Agreement agreed to transition away from fossil fuels, which is, you know, that's 190 countries or something like that. But when you look at BOGA, only about 12 or 13 countries are willing to put their name to that. So I think some people might say that's quite revealing. Do you want me to add a bit more about how fossil fuels were dealt with this year, or maybe Simon might want to jump in on that one?
I think it's worth, you know, Daisy or Simon sort of expanding on that a little bit, because it definitely was interesting and a noticeable difference, it seemed, compared to the Dubai COP to this COP. Suddenly that you had the agreement on that language, and then suddenly it felt a little bit awkward for everyone at this COP.
Do you want me to go? Yeah, so basically this was kind of, yeah, one of the core bits that I was following, and basically there were several different places in the negotiations, several different agenda items where this could have been carried forward, and it was obviously a big priority for many countries involved at the COP, particularly vulnerable countries and you know, developed countries like the EU. And yeah, so there was people might remember there was a kind of an agenda fight, so called, at the start of the COP, because they couldn't agree about where to put you know, a particular thing on the agenda, and effectively it was a proxy battle about whether or not they should substantively take forward this global stock take outcome from last year, including that text on transitioning away from fossil fuels. So you had one group of countries, I would say probably the large majority of countries, that wanted a substantive outcome. So not, you know, we've agreed to this stuff, transitioning away from fossil fuels, tripling renewables, a bunch of other stuff. And not only have we agreed to that, but we're going to actually have a process that's going to track that. You know, how are we actually getting on? We're going to have some kind of reporting back, and we want some kind of thing that pops up on the agenda at every COP each year, so that we can talk about this again and make sure that it doesn't just get forgotten. And then there was another group of countries that were very much against anything substantive of that nature. And so ultimately, over the course of the 2 weeks, they fought over, first of all, where exactly on the agenda to put that kind of stuff. And then at the end, they came up with it ended up in this thing called the UAE dialogue that I already mentioned. And at one point there was a text that kind of referred back to the stock take from last year and kind of reiterated the commitment. It didn't actually directly say the transitioning away from fossil fuels, it just referred to the relevant part of the stock take text. So it was a bit hidden and oblique. But then it did include a bunch of kind of process and hooks into future agendas, at COPs in future years. But then the final draft that was presented in the plenary at the close of COP29, all of that kind of processy stuff had gone, and effectively all they had was an agreement to talk about stuff for 2 years and not even produce a report at the end of it. And that's ultimately why a group of, a number of negotiating blocks kind of made interventions in that closing plenary. So there was like AOSIS, the small island developing states. There was ILAC, the Latin American countries, and the EIG, which is an environmental integrity group, includes countries like Switzerland, and also the umbrella group, which includes people like Canada, Australia, and the UK. And all of those blocks basically intervened and said, we don't agree with this text. And as a result, it's all been punted to next year. And they'll obviously have the challenge of, trying to negotiate something on this, carrying forward that stock take outcome, transitioning away from fossil fuels and all of that in a year. And obviously, you might expect that the Brazilian presidency would be quite keen on getting something good out of that. But on the other hand, there's going to be a whole other geopolitical context on the way as of January when Trump takes over as US president. So there's obviously no guarantee at all that a stronger outcome will be possible next year.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Daisy. Wan Yuan, we've got a question here about kind of what leadership role did China play at the COP? And now running into the COP, there's always fascination with how China approaches a COP. There always has been. And Simon just mentioned the geopolitical situation. There was a lot of talk at the COP about, would China, with Trump coming into power, would this be a moment where China almost sort of takes the lead to some degree in the COP process? We published some analysis right in the middle of the COP, showing that China's historic emissions have now just overtaken the EU. So we've got some really interesting kind of dynamics. We've got other analysis we've been publishing through the years showing, wondering whether China is almost reaching this kind of almost fabled moment of peak emissions. We don't really know yet, but it's kind of very interesting, the data at the moment. So what was your take on how China approached these talks? We've had a question. It's someone anonymous. I don't know who that is. I can't put a name to it, but it is definitely an interesting question.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I think, so from my interviews, someone from the National Center of Climate Strategy and International Cooperation told me that China definitely has concerns, over Trump being re-elected as the US president. But at the same time, China's strategy won't really change, and they're still very much willing to take more active roles, in global cooperation. And I think this similar idea has been echoed by Liu Zhenming, the new climate envoy at COP. So I think this is the kind of like basic attitude China shows towards global climate change cooperation. But at the same time, Wen Hua, he is the deputy director of the Department of Resources, Conservation and Environmental Protection at NDRC, which is China's top planner, said at an event that I attended at COP, saying that China is willing to take a more active role in global climate governance. So this definitely shows that China may not outspoken as it is willing to take more leadership role, but it is ready to do more. So this kind of similar idea has been echoed by other number of multiple senior officials at COP and during interviews. And also to kind of add more information, so China strongly identifies itself as the developing country and representing the basic country, as Aruna has previously mentioned. And together with the G77, China definitely did some more actions on this. And together with the G77, it says it wants public grants of $500 billion per year. Even at the closing plenary, China agrees with what everybody else agreed, but is not super happy with the number developed countries committed. And this can be shown on today's foreign ministry's response to questions about NCQG and COP in general.
Brilliant, thank you, Wan Yuan. I'm trying to squeeze quite a few different questions that are coming in around kind of like the future of COPs. It's quite a big question, but kind of as we go towards Brazil, there's some questions asking, what does this road out to Brazil look like? But then there's other people asking, I don't know, you probably remember that at the beginning of the first week, there was this kind of this letter that made headlines, basically from sort of senior scientists and former people associated with the Paris Agreement, basically saying, the current COP process is a bit broken and needs reform. Which is always a bit of a discussion that goes on at COPs. And I think it probably is worth kind of pausing and sort of focusing on those questions a bit. I don't know, maybe Molly first, slightly hospital past probably, but give us a sense of maybe on that point, the first point about the near term, about what happens now in the run up to the Brazil COP? Are there some sort of staging posts? I think Daisy's already mentioned some things, and then we can maybe pan out and talk about this wider discussion there is about, is the COP the right kind of forum, the process, the mechanism for, on the international stage? So maybe Molly, and then I'll bring in some others as well.
Sure. So I think the main staging post to keep an eye on will be next June, where they meet for technical discussions. This normally occurs in Bonn, but there's some discussion about it occurring in a different location, not because of anything to do with this COP, just because they're doing renovation works. So we're not entirely sure where that will be, but it'll be next June. I think that will be particularly important to keep an eye on this year. or this coming year, sorry, because of how many things got pushed down the road at this COP. I don't have the official figures, but from people that I talked to at the COP, the number of items that got Rule 16 and got pushed back was much higher than we'd normally ever see. So June will be a real point for getting negotiators in a room, people with real technical experience to sort of hammer out some of the problems that we've seen in the different negotiating tracks. So if we're looking ahead towards COP30 and what we can expect from that, that will be a really sort of key moment to get a clue about whether or not we're going to see progress on particularly things like the Just Transition Work Programme or the UAE dialogue that really didn't sort of end with a real win at COP29. Daisy, I don't know if you want to add some more.
Just quickly, Molly, on that point, we've got another key thing that's going to happen next year, right? Is that every 5 years we have a big kind of COP, right? So we've had the Paris COP in 2015, we had the Glasgow COP meant to be in 2020, but obviously the pandemic knocked it to 2021. But now we've got the Brazil COP coming up in 25, and within that cycle, within the kind of Paris agreements kind of ratchet mechanism, if you like, you have these what we call nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, or basically the national climate pledges. That's a big moment for next year. They're due, I think, technically, by the end of February or something, but I think the expectation is realistically is that many countries will take it right up to Brazil. Daisy, I don't know if you wanted to come in on that, sorry.
I can just add that Brazil in particular, as well as being a big COP for mitigation because of the NDCs, as you say, will also be seen as a nature COP because it's being held very close to the Amazon rainforest, and the Brazilian presidency has already sort of indicated they intend to incorporate nature in a way that I've heard lots of people say that has not been seen since COP26. So yeah, that might be something to look out for.
Aruna, on this question around are COPs fit for purpose, is there an alternative, etc. It was very noticeable in that final plenary where it was actually a little bit confusing, just as an observer watching, that what happened with that gaveling of the finance deal, and then India and then Nigeria coming in and saying we object to this, etc. And it was a little bit unclear, I think, to many observers what exactly was going on, and it kind of led to wider questions around what is this kind of so-called consensus agreement and what is the process. Can you maybe unpick that a little bit and explain that?
I think, of course, Josh has spoken about the finance discussions and how heated they were. And it's also been one that's been 3 years in the making, right? So countries have been there, been part of the process, and yet we saw only the last we got a number only towards the end of the COP. That's on a Friday. That's when 250 billion, technically on the day, the COP is supposed to end. So in terms of, do you leave without an objection? Do you leave? Is that particularly so that received, of course, a lot of pushback. And then there's a very limited time to have and debate that number in terms of the actual negotiation. Of course, there was a deal with that eventually was struck, but doesn't mean that majority of countries were not happy with it. And towards like the plenary which was going on, there is also still a space where you can object. Now, whether it's an overwhelming number of countries that have decided to, either make a statement or object, and that was the Indian government has said that it had submitted a request to the Secretariat as well as to the presidency. It wanted to make a statement ahead of the decision being adopted. And they said that they were not given the opportunity to speak. I'm sure maybe Simon can get into that. But of course, if there's not as many countries, or if it was just a three, or if there's not a majority, the presidency could have taken that call, and which is why the question around it being state managed. But yeah, if there was as little of a time, and as Josh also pointed out, the sort of geopolitical scenario of, is this the best that you can get, or the best that you can get for now, in terms of expectations, when it's nowhere close to what countries have been asking for, and or in the format that they wanted. So yeah, that was the source of much fury, which was vocalized in India's intervention.
Simon, do you want to come in on this question around this kind of almost kind of meta question around what is the COP process right for now? Is there any alternative? Probably no, not really at a geopolitical and global level. But do you want to speak to that point a bit?
Yeah, so I guess that there's maybe 2 or 3 different aspects to this. So just specifically on this question about decision making and what Aruna was just talking about, how the COP president basically gavelled through the finance deal over the objections of Nigeria and India. I don't know if I'm not sure if everyone can see this, but I shared a link in the chat and perhaps we can circulate it somehow. But we had a really interesting guest post about how decisions are taken at the COP and what consensus decision making means in practice, which the long and short of it is basically even if there are 1 or 2 objections, you can still reach an agreement. But there's not like hard and fast rules around that, and it's more of an art than a science, according to that post. And specifically on the decision that India and Nigeria objected to, Joanna de Pledge, who wrote that guest post for us, told us, and we put this in our COP summary, that she watched back the plenary and quite carefully, and she said that as far as she could tell, the only ones to sort of officially object to that climate finance decision weren't Nigeria and India, even though there are other countries voicing their displeasure about it. None of them were sort of officially objecting, and so that's why she thought that was why the COP president felt able to gavel that through, even though there was obviously some significant disquiet about the nature of the decision. Then in terms more broadly of like the COP process, I mean, this kind of comes up every year. It's ultimately an expression of people's frustration with the fact that we're not making fast enough progress on climate change to limit warming to safe levels, and people want the COP to be the thing that solves that. But ultimately, anything decided at the COP is only as kind of strong as the action that governments, businesses, and people on the ground actually take to implement things. And that's why those next NDCs that you already mentioned, Leo, are so important for next year. And I guess just like the final point, before I let Aruna come back in, is just on looking back 10 years. I think you maybe mentioned this briefly earlier, Leo, but if you look back 10 years at where we're heading in terms of warming, it was expected to be like 3.5+ degrees of warming this century, and now the best projections suggest we're looking at more like 2.5 degrees. Now, obviously, that still implies catastrophic warming, terrible impacts for people and ecosystems around the planet. But it's obviously a big improvement on 3.5. And we can't sort of say that the COP is the only reason for that happening. There's all sorts of factors that have contributed to that. But I think it's fair to say that the COP has been part of the progress that we've made since the Paris Agreement a decade ago.
Thanks, Simon. I just while explaining that particular moment, forgot the wider point that I was trying to make, which is the fact that this is, again, we're talking about consensus-based decision-making, and the fact that you have representation from all countries, all of them are able to vote and also make their voices heard, and to be able to have a role in some really key outcomes which have ramifications. I felt like a lot of the doom and gloom, especially around this COP, was strange because it's also something with an actual tenable outcome. We are talking about climate finance for the next 5 years, which is really valuable for large sets of vulnerable countries as well. And this is a place where you can actually have that number negotiated and put on the table. We are also talking about Article 6, which is going to, the rules which were made here will have ramifications and set standards for what happens for the next, again, how many ever years. So, I mean, it's quite crucial that that countries have a say, especially since a lot of these, either the projects are being located in their countries or in terms of emission reductions or in terms of finance that reaches. And it's a one forum where, again, a small island state still gets to have a say and perhaps even in the group walk out of the deal to make a point. Or walk out of the room. And it's not just your major powers, not just the G20 or the G7 that get to make these decisions or have a say. So I think it's really important. And it's also where civil society can be outside the rooms, observers can take a part. There's a lot of the other stuff that is incredibly valuable, and to hold the line on some of these things. And we've seen how that has also made changes or, helped hold governments as well to account. And this is one of the few places that it can, actually happen, and kind of also visibly you can see through the process making a difference.
Thanks, Aruna. We've got another anonymous question, but it's an interesting one around, and there's a few sort of related to this. Kind of what does this COP mean kind of in the real world? Like someone's asking, what does this mean for the private sector, for businesses, directly sort of downstream from these very top level sort of political kind of national, international levels? I don't know, Josh, and maybe Wang Yuan, the issue of, the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism and trade tariffs and all these things that we're hearing about in the kind of quote unquote real world. What was your sense, maybe start with you, Josh, what was your sense of how, and we've talked already about carbon markets, that will definitely have a, downstream impact on some, on opportunities perhaps for some businesses. What was your sense of this connection between COP outcomes and quote unquote the real world, particularly at kind of maybe sort of private, even citizen level? I don't know. It's quite a tricky question to answer, I think.
So I can't really, to be honest, speak to the CBAM stuff so much, although while I was writing about it before the COP, I didn't really follow the discussions about it at COP so much, but maybe Aruna could speak to that. But in terms of the sort of impact on the private sector from the finance negotiations, I mean, there's kind of, haven't really explained so much the sort of wider part of the finance goal, which people might have seen, which is this 1.3 trillion target, which is, I would say, not really a target so much in the sense that the 300 billion is a target, because it's a kind of like, it's a call for that level of finance to be reached from all kinds of sources, and that includes the private sector. The thing is, the private sector isn't kind of obliged to do anything under the climate finance goal. Like, kind of these kind of things can send signals, I suppose, but it's quite sort of vague in that respect. So whether or not the finance goal will compel, businesses to invest more in developing countries, I don't know. I've not heard people like express much enthusiasm about that. The 300 billion contains, it includes mobilized climate finance, which is about kind of, which is private finance that is comes about because governments make kind of an initial public investment, for example. So, maybe it's too expensive to build wind turbines in Malawi, but some government investment from the global north might make that investment more of a sort of promising project. So yeah, I suppose that has implications for the private sector and for companies working to do climate projects in those countries. But yeah, I'll pass the question on to someone else, perhaps. Yeah, who can
Well,
speak?
I was asking about the trade tariffs because it's in the news at the moment, and obviously Wang Yuan, particularly with China, the EU, US, Donald Trump coming in. I don't know if it kind of fed into the negotiations. I know Aruna's going to speak to this, but Wang Yuan, did you get any sense of whether China, for example, made any interventions kind of somehow within the negotiations that sort of fed into that debate?
So I don't really think I have heard anything at COP from the officials that talked about things like CBAMs particularly, or trade, but I might have missed it. But I did have a quite interesting conversation with the director of the environment management and planning at the Tsinghua University, which is a very prominent university in China. So he mentioned about CBAM particularly and about trade barriers. So previously, when Chinese officials were talking about green trade barriers, they said this would slow down, the global cooperation, especially for the developing countries. And when I asked this director specifically about what are the green trade barriers, and he said it would be tariffs and some kind of trade restrictions, mainly with the US. And when I asked about the EU CBAM, and he said EU CBAM is positive for EU itself, and so far the impact on China is not that large. So it's considered, combining with my previous information when I did the CBAM piece with Josh. So CBAM in China so far, and some developing countries, even though they don't like it, and the impact is not as huge as some may have thought. But if EU CBAM continuing to expand to the upstream and downstream of the sections it has already covered and the sectors it has already covered, then it's going to hit China quite heavily. So that's the information I can give you for now. And I think Aruna should be able to provide more insights on this.
Yeah, thanks, Josh and Manyuan. I think it was, again, the second year in a row where we have seen a proposal from BASIC coming in to put these discussions on the COP agenda. And because of this particular situation where the WTO is often said, okay, this is not a place to be having this conversation. Where should this conversation sit? Because it's related to climate, right? And this was why it was also included as there was a push to include it on the official agenda. It wasn't included. But now, especially, one of the fun things of following the response measures track, which many people see as a staging ground for various debates. But the fact is that there is actually some really interesting work that's going on there that looks at just transitions, that looks at the role of, okay, what is the private sector playing? How can workers, how can businesses, how can affected communities be able to play a role, and how can countries integrate that into their new climate pledges? Where do you outline these challenges? How do you measure the impacts of something like an EU CBAM on economies? Can we have that officially done? Now, that was where, especially there was also a push to include this and talking about unilateral trade measures, and that eventually got captured in the work plan, where it is for discussion. Of course, it was labeled cross-border impacts, and the language around unilateralism is also a reference. It's there in the UN Climate Convention, and that's included. So there are places, and the work plan actually has a bunch where businesses can participate, where and it's going to be easy. And one of the things, which is the fact that, of course, people in climate negotiations know something about trade people know something about climate, but they don't know enough about each other, and they're not exactly talking to each other. And I think that this is a particularly interesting space to be able to create that. And if there are issues that parties, as well as stakeholders, as well as businesses, communities can have that area to be able to talk, versus being outside the negotiations, trying to influence them to talk about actual real challenges and what are those impacts of global climate policies. They did a case study on like how the Maldives could be affected by sustainable aviation or by shipping, right, and what effect that has on economy. There's a case study around that, a body of experts that are looking at that, and how global policies actually make a difference in the rest of the world. So worth examining, and it's not as neat and black and white as the rest of the conversation. They get in tricky territory, but it's interesting. Yeah, and it's work that's happening at the UNFCCC, so worth following.
Thanks, Aruna. We've probably got about, let's have a look at the time, probably 6-7 minutes left. So we can probably try and squeeze in a couple more questions. But there's one here for Molly, I think, which is from Ian Hawker, who's asking, what progress was there on climate adaptation, and why is this topic so difficult? I mean, we haven't really talked about adaptation, which often happens at COPs. Unfortunately, mitigation, finance and things always take the sort of star billing, but it is a vitally important topic. And, the sort of related discussion around loss and damage as well. Molly, do you want to give us a sense of what happened on adaptation at COP29?
Sure. So yeah, officially there was 5 different tracks that it could have been covered in. 3 of them were really quite technical. There were sort of reviews, reports and stuff like that. So seeing them get pushed to next year is probably not that surprising. The 2 most significant were the national adaptation plans and the global goal on adaptation. Those are the 2 tracks that did sort of keep pushing through for a while. So NAP's national adaptation plans, The presidency in the first week said that because there were technical conversations that they weren't going to carry them forwards. There was a minor uproar about that from people in the room who argued that so much progress had been made that they really wanted to keep pushing forwards on it. So it got resurrected in the second week, but there was no compromise in the end, and the final draft decision had more than 140 square brackets in it, which is undecided elements of the text. So ultimately, despite this sort of big push that we saw around the middle weekend of COP, it did get pushed to next year. And the global goal on adaptation is the one bit that we did see a final text on. The most challenging elements in that, which I think kind of give you an idea of what the most challenging elements for adaptation overall were means of adaptation and transformational adaptation. So means of implementation even is to do with finance more than anything else. It's how you make adaptation happen. And I think one of the big things we can say about adaptation and why it often doesn't get as much focus as mitigation is you're putting money in and there's not kind of the commercial case often that you would see with mitigation. So a big part of mitigation is transitioning away from fossil fuels. It's moving towards renewable energy, and there is a big economic incentive for people to get involved in that in a way that there's not often with adaptation projects. If you build a solar farm, you're probably going to make some money out of it. If you build a dam to stop people's villages getting flooded, probably not. That's a simplistic take on it, obviously, but that is definitely one of the sort of core things that we see coming up over and over again. I will say that we did get final text on the global goal on adaptation. There had been some pushback against the language around means of implementation and the possibility of changing it to enablers of implementation, which is a kind of soft, fuzzy medium to kind of try and keep everyone happy, which absolutely kept no one happy. So the final text was back to means of implementation, which is a minor win for sort of developing countries. And the other thing about it is that we did see officially that global goal on adaptation is going to be a standing item on the agenda going forwards at COP, which was an uncertainty beforehand, and that the Baku adaptation roadmap has been officially launched. So we will get much more focus and more progress on adaptation, hopefully over the next couple of years.
Brilliant. Thank you, Molly. Yeah, we're definitely running out of time, but there's definitely an interesting question here from, well, there's been a few questions related to this. Someone's asking about, how do oceans get captured in the climate COP process? Terry Sloan is asking, Daisy, you mentioned biodiversity it's mentioned in Baku, but how does this complement what was discussed at the biodiversity COP? And obviously got the Brazil, you've already mentioned, Daisy, the Brazil COP coming next year. Maybe Daisy, do you want to just take that on and explain how the biodiversity track and themes and discussions get captured and how they might complement the COP16 process that happened in Colombia a month ago?
Sure, thank you. So yes, COP16 in Colombia finished about a week before COP29, but you would be kind of forgiven for forgetting about that because there were very few high-level mentions or initiatives about biodiversity being launched in Azerbaijan. So the presidency sets their own kind of action agenda for the non-negotiated outcomes. So when you see countries coming together to make a new pledge or something like that, and their action agenda didn't cover really biodiversity, oceans, nature. And if you compare that to last year in Dubai, there was quite a lot on linking up climate and biodiversity actions. So yeah, and also if you go back to COP26 again, there was a lot of deforestation initiatives and things like that. There wasn't that much this year. So looking forward to next year, I think, as I mentioned previously, Brazil intends to make COP30 a nature COP, and I have heard from the Brazilian presidency that they've been working with the COP16 Colombian presidency to try and ensure that biodiversity is incorporated. I did actually attend an event on the kind of links between the climate and nature conventions where there was somebody from the Brazilian ministry, and I asked him if he'd ever consider making a negotiated agenda item on linking up biodiversity loss and climate change, because it is discussed at biodiversity talks but not really at climate talks. And he said that Brazil's preference would be to bring biodiversity in more to negotiating tracks that already exist and not create a new agenda item. But they still plan to do sort of the non-negotiated outcome stuff, so more big pledges on deforestation, oceans, biodiversity, that kind of thing, I think we can expect next year.
Brilliant. Thank you, Daisy. We're almost out of time, and I just wanted to say a big thanks to the people that sent about. Molly's just counted up. There's 180 questions or something in the chat box. So really sorry for not being able to get through to all of those, but obviously huge interest. Just while we wrap up just very quickly, sort of 20 seconds from everyone, can you just each of you in turn give us a sense of what to look out for in the 12 months ahead as we run up to Brazil? Maybe if I go with you, Simon, first.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already mentioned this, but the big thing over the next 12 months is the next round of NDCs. This COP basically passed up any opportunity to give guidance to countries on what should be in those NDCs, but there are already some things they have to do. They do already have to take the stocktake into account and say how they've done that. But obviously the quality of those NDCs, the ambition that they contain, is entirely up to the countries that put them forward.
Thanks, Simon. Josh, what about for you for the next sort of 12 months or so?
Sorry. Well, we will have countries will be releasing more information about the climate finance that they contribute in some reports that are due out in December. And yes, I think there will be kind of pressure to flesh out ways of scaling up finance to the kind of the more aspirational 1.3 trillion goal. Yeah, and then kind of that's and this as part of this sort of Baku to Belém program, which I mentioned, I think that will need a bit of fleshing out if they're going to produce a report for the next COP.
Okay, thank you. Aruna, hopefully we can just squeeze in everyone very quickly before we sign off. Aruna, what would you say?
I think we can look forward to seeing how green trade wars play out, and seeing how the wider outside politics and what did Milei actually mean, and seeing how that progresses, seeing how the Brazilian G20 presidency proceeds in its run up to the COP, and yeah, I think definitely looking forward to everybody getting some sleep.
Sleep, that sounds like a great word. Molly, what would you say?
I think, again, pointing to those June meetings and seeing whether or not we're going to see any more progress on areas of negotiations that have just been in deadlock sort of time after time, whether or not we can go into the next COP on a slightly better footing for certain key elements.
And when we're obviously everyone's waiting for China's NDC to land. We published, you steered a piece a few weeks ago asking lots of experts to give their thoughts on that. What are your sort of things you're looking at in the months ahead?
I think we would probably focusing on whether there will be changes on China's timeline for dual carbon goals, whether China would want to peak even earlier than before 2030, and also whether China would make more commitment and donate more money to global climate finance.
Brilliant, thank you. And Daisy, you've got the last word.
I'll continue with my watch out what happens on biodiversity. Also to say there are rumours that we'll get a resumed session of the COP16 Biodiversity Summit in February in Rome. So that would be very exciting if that happens.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks so much to my colleagues. The mention of sleep is highly appealing now. I think we're all totally on all kinds of weird time zones and kind of all over the place, as I'm sure many people on this call are who've been involved in the COP or watching it closely. But just want to say, yeah, huge thanks to obviously my colleagues, obviously everyone who's joined the call today. And yeah, so hopefully this video will be, the recording of this will be put online shortly. But yeah, thanks again. And yeah, we'll see you next year in Brazil, I guess. Okay, bye everyone.